Good evening. My name is Bill Kovich. As curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalists here at Harvard, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Joe Alex Morris Jr. Lecture. The lecture in this series have been made possible by a fund created by the family and the friends and the Harvard classmates of Joe Alex Morris Jr., who received his degree here in 1949 and for the next 30 years pursued a career of distinction as a foreign newspaper correspondent. Joe was killed by a sniper's bullet while covering the revolution in Iran in 1979. And this, the 11th lecture in the series, is part of our effort to honor his memory and his work by recognizing and encouraging standards of exceptional courage and excellence in foreign reporting by American journalists. Few journalists of our time so completely embody those principles as does tonight's lecturer, Peter Arnett, senior correspondent for CNN Television Network. You all know him as the lone American journalist who remained in Baghdad during the war in Iraq and sent home the gripping images of a city being slowly obliterated by laser-guided missiles and bombs, and the only images we received of a war's effect on civilians. Those of us who have known Peter Arnett longer before his latest display have seen the depth of his commitment and his fearless pursuit of stories before. As a correspondent for the Associated Press, Peter covered more of the war in Vietnam than any other reporter. In the process, he won the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting in 1966. His reports from Southeast Asia made up the most sustained coverage of that war. At a time when each day was a lifetime, and while other correspondents came and went, Peter stayed with the story from 1962 until the fall of Saigon in 1975. He stayed in a large part because he felt an obligation to his readers to accumulate and share the knowledge and insights he gained each day. And 20 years later, in a world away, it was this same dogged commitment to his obligation to those who receive his reports that kept Peter Arnett in Baghdad despite the combined efforts of the government of Iraq, the government of the United States, and some of the management at CNN to get him to leave. These are the standards upon which a free press and a free people depend, and Peter Arnett's devotion to them is what makes him a natural to deliver the Joe Alex Morris Lecture here tonight. Please welcome Peter Arnett.
Thank you, Bill Kovach. When you were describing those missiles descending on Baghdad and all that chaos, I was thinking, what about your last days in the Constitution in Atlanta? If I remember it, it was verbally as dangerous as what I was doing in Baghdad. It's a pleasure to be back here with this institution again. I was here a decade ago during the Carter administration, participating in a debate on the Vietnam War. So a decade later, we have the Gulf War. Who knows in the early part of next century? No, I'm not retiring. But times have really changed. I don't have to tell you that. We all know that. And no less in the assumptions that we journalists hold as in the rest of society and the rest of the world. I've been a foreign correspondent, as Bill mentioned, for more than 30 years, and at times these days I feel my professional moorings are coming loose. Much of my reporting, as with my colleagues, was anchored in the Cold War. They were anxious times, to be sure, but also predictable. The enemy was initially easy to identify, the powerful, enigmatic Soviet Union with its international tentacles magnifying our political phobias. I first encountered that phenomena as a young reporter in the Laos of the late 1950s, where the CIA was trying to shore up a right-wing military regime thought favorable to our side. It was a choice taken in other Southeast Asian countries. Wrong choice, we know. And then after Vietnam, I was in Central America covering the clandestine conflicts there, seemingly now the last hot flashes of the Cold War, and then on to Moscow in the mid-1980s, where the CIA again harbored the gravest suspicions about the motivations of Mikhail Gorbachev. Of course, wrong again, but then everyone was caught unawares by the speed of change brought about by that individual, of course, including Mikhail Sergeyevich himself. The Cold War, you know, it was such a predictable scenario for reporters to act upon. It was a time of easy labeling, our guys against their guys. It was not hard to see the global confrontation as part of a continuing contest between them and us. We kept the scorecard. Which side was winning the political, the military, even the sports confrontations? We in the press tried, I suppose, to avoid being trapped by Cold War stereotypes, and our reporting sometimes helped thwart or end impudent or reckless policies by our government. But living with the potential for nuclear annihilation for so long, there can be no doubt that much of what we presented was darkened by political partiality. But with the Cold War thawed, with our old enemy vaporized with the tides of history, it is time maybe for the mainstream American media to rethink how it covers international news. Not maybe, a fact that it's necessary. One of America's last great exports is freedom of speech, and by that I mean the free flow of information of all kinds to those who wish to acquire it. The end of the Cold War has opened up an era of information communication that is unique on this earth. The major crises of the century were generated in part by those who attempted to impose political theories on mankind, but fascism and communism both totally failed to provide the answers to man's search for perfection, and they've paid the price for that failure. What the world seems to know now is that the basis of all human growth is democratic governance and enlightened economic development, not political dream-making. So the scramble for information to make all that possible, to change the world, is a dynamic for change that we can barely appreciate how eager is this scramble. So rapidly is it occurring. Now, the United States has long led the world in dispensing information, and by that I mean all kinds of information. We have the freest press in the world and the largest book and magazine publishing industry. Our television news programming leads the world. Our movie industry at its best is uniquely capable of touching the sensitivities of a whole world audience. Computer links internationally are way ahead of governments, have been for years. While as in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s, the academic institutions over there joined in computer links with American institutions of learning and began trading more information than either of their governments desired, went on anyway. In the cable industry in the United States, we're definitely at the forefront of technological development. So imagine a world that wants all of what we just take for granted, and you see what lies ahead for those willing to help pioneer this new age of internationalism. CNN's founder, Ted Turner, moved into this field a decade ago, and look at his rewards. Times Man of the Year and Jane Fonda. The cutting edge of this change is basically technology. Throughout Europe, entrepreneurs are putting together deals to develop, for example, cable television programming. They've overcome years of entrenched opposition by almost xenophobic governments who try to control the flow and dissemination of programming. I'm talking even about Western Europe. France, Britain, in the guise of preventing what they call cultural imperialism, stemmed the flow of television news and entertainment. They controlled it at home and allowed little to come from abroad. But now the marketplace is talking. Viewers in Europe, they want to watch CNN, they want to watch CBS. They want to learn directly about the United States this way and other countries. Europe is changing in other ways, too. Hey, the French government even gave Sylvester Stallone a cultural medal recently to demonstrate that it's hip. We talk about a global village that's emerging, a new world order global village. Well, if there is a global village, news coverage is the voice of that village. Without a voice, the world of change that some are envisaging, that say has to come, will not come about too easily. Now, we in the media have no illusions about our role in shaping the public's perception of events. The truth is we do exercise enormous influence over what people think. Politicians, industry, lobbyists, and other power centers also know that we influence what people think. Here in the United States, of course, we journalists are inspired by the principles of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. But even here, where these rights are upheld in our 200-year-old Constitution, they're constantly being challenged by those who would prefer an unquestioning obedience to much of what government does, particularly in times of national crisis. Here is one example of how those pressure groups function. Just last year, I'm holding some of the thousands of identically worded postcards sent to CNN during the early coverage of the Gulf War last year. They come from people living in Coral Gables, Florida, and Crossville, Tennessee, Kokomo, Indiana, Escondido, California. They're all addressed to Mr. Turner. This one, actually, the Mr. was crossed out, and it's been scrawled, "You unmitigated ass." But here is what all these cards say. I am appalled to see how you are all helping Saddam Hussein air his propaganda throughout the world. If Peter Arnett's broadcasts were not helpful to Saddam Hussein, he would pull the plug instantly. He is counting on you to help him erode our morale and break up the coalition. Lord Haw tried to do this for Hitler in World War II. Lord Haw, of course, was the British aristocrat who joined the Nazis. He was convicted of treason and hanged. If you have any love for your country and consideration for our troops, you will call Arnett home. I will tune out as long as Arnett and his crew continue to serve as the voice of Baghdad. Now, these postcards originated with an extreme conservative political organization, the same actually that demonstrated in front of CNN with this placard here that says, "Welcome back, Baghdad Pete," demonstrated there and elsewhere in the country. However, CNN did not waver in its commitment to the Gulf War story. It even put some of the negative mail on the air. In the national hysteria, in fact, in the first days of the war, some cable contractors wanted to break their commitments to CNN. Some advertisers even canceled their ads. But I'm delighted to report today that the good sense of CNN and the good sense of the American public seem to have prevailed. A national survey of public attitudes taken this past January by the Los Angeles Times newspaper found that 82% of viewers approved of CNN's performance as a news organization, with only 2% negative, much higher than most newspapers surveyed. That survey is a vindication to all of us in the news business and in CNN. In the aftermath of the Gulf War, it seems that the public realized that candid reporting from both sides is a requirement for our democracy to function. Of course, so much in the heat of such a crisis, the messenger is blamed. Now, my journalism career has been an ongoing struggle to uphold the freedom of the press, starting from my early days covering the Vietnam War to my most recent experience in the Gulf War. I've been the target of hostile governments. I've been expelled from 5 countries for trying to report the truth. I've been arrested and detained by 2 countries for covering controversial news stories. I've been investigated by government security agencies seeking to discredit my reputation, including one American security institution. But then probably 3/4 of you here have been investigated by that organization. The struggle for total freedom of the press, as called for in our Constitution, has intensified, really, with CNN's pioneering of live television. Our real-time coverage of the Gulf War, after all, let a worldwide audience see events as they were actually happening. It was information being transferred instantly, allowing the public, on this occasion, to make up its own mind about what was happening, or helping to make up its own mind. Now, this phenomenon apparently clearly worried the authorities who traditionally, in times of national crisis, demand to totally control the flow of information, demands that are not covered in our Constitution. I mean, the government is clearly concerned with public opinion. It might be adversely affected by the free flow of information. This is not just the United States, it's Britain and other countries during the Gulf War. But even under controlled conditions, I would argue that live coverage is still possible. Information can get through. Because I believe that what happened in Baghdad last year and what we're able to do can happen in the future. We can actually go live any way we want to. And we may get other occasions when we are reporting live under constrained conditions. Now in Baghdad, the Iraqi government invited CNN to remain during the war, but it did impose certain conditions, particularly control of military information. So in Baghdad, how did I handle problems such as the Iraqi censorship of my dispatches? Well, the handling was mercurial, to say the least. I have here the dispatch I wrote early February last year about the confirmed presence in Baghdad of correspondent CBS Bob Simon and his crew. They were being held in prison. Their whereabouts had been unknown since their disappearance several weeks earlier while they were on assignment along the Kuwaiti-Saudi Arabian border. In this dispatch, I specifically mentioned the location where the CBS people were being held, the actual security building in the Karada district of Baghdad. After I delivered this report live on camera on February 7 last year, the Iraqi official who had given me the information in the first place and was monitoring my broadcast at my elbow, he took the script from me and he crossed out a paragraph, and in it was the location of where they were being held. And I told him, I said, look, I've already broadcast it. And he said, well, you shouldn't have been so specific. Just don't tell anyone around here you did it, which is... But I have here a more typical example of how it worked. In this report, I describe a visit to a part of Baghdad bombed during the previous night. I wrote that we saw a block of small businesses destroyed, along with some private homes. But they censored out a specific paragraph, and that dealt exactly where the actual bombing took place. It was the approaches to one of the important Baghdad bridges near two government ministries. The Iraqis said if I'd mentioned those facts, it would have amounted to a bomb damage assessment, and I wasn't permitted to do that. I tried to write in that we weren't permitted to mention the location of the targets. They took out that too. Now, if those facts had been retained in the report, you, the viewers, the listeners, would probably have figured out that maybe it was an accidental bombing because it was near military targets. The fact that that information was in, there could be an issue of civilian casualties. There may be the comment, well, gee, what are we doing bombing civilians? I mean, it could be a propaganda point. And, of course, the issue of civilian casualties is a primary one in any war because of its emotional content. Now, to balance that, on one hand, we had CNN allowed the Pentagon, British military, and, of course, spokespeople in the Gulf to give their side of the story. We gave a lot of their side of the story. And specifically in that case, they mentioned that it was, if it happened at all, it had to be accidental. But I also endeavored to compensate in Baghdad through the question and answer sessions that the Iraqis allowed us to deliver each day after my initial news report was delivered. And I'd like to think that in future coverage, countries will allow us to converse, because that is the nature of live television. That's what they see when they're looking at CNN today. Now, this allows long verbal exchanges between myself, the correspondent, and CNN's anchors that were talking to me from Washington and Atlanta. So conversations routinely went something like this. I had Bob Kane in Atlanta. He said to me, Peter, I know you can't talk about this, but when you visited Basra the other day, was there much military traffic? The Pentagon says the bombing has stopped all that military traffic to the war front. And my response was, Bob, there was a mighty lot of traffic on that highway the other day and not much of it civilian. Well, it didn't mention military. Or this exchange from Reed Collins, our anchorman in Washington. Peter, the Pentagon says the Iraqis are moving tanks and anti-aircraft guns into civilian areas to escape the bombing. Is this true? My response was, Reed, if I tell you what I know about that topic, the Israelis would pull me off the air. So what did these censored reports and my Q&A sessions add up to? I think I was able to respond to many of the most pressing questions that Americans wanted answers to, to give a sense of what it was like living in a country being pounded with the most intensive air raids in history. And I think we were able to chart the deterioration and fears of Iraqi society as the bombing continued, and the frustration of the average man on the street with his government. But there were real pressures from both sides immediate. At my elbow, for example, each time I was on the air, and sometimes it was 8 times a day, and I was on it every day from the beginning of the war to the end, there was an Iraqi always at my elbow. At the other end of the line, in Atlanta, our headquarters, the producers wanted to get as much information as they could. So if you could imagine, each day I'm on the air, and the chief Iraqi minder, Mr. Sadoun al-Janabi, a portly gentleman, educated in Scotland, he'd be wagging his finger at me as I broadcast, often in a stage whisper from the shade of the Al-Rashid Hotel terrace palm trees. I would hear him saying, "Peter, you're giving too much detail. Remember the rules." And then over my audio line from Atlanta that was into my ear, I'd hear the voice of executive producer Bob Fernandez. He'd be saying, "Hey, Peter, we need more detail. Remember, the whole world's watching." So I'm on the air live, and the bombs are falling, sometimes in the vicinity. Metal fragments sometimes sizzle in the nearby hotel pool. Here is Mr. Sadoun in the corner of my eye wagging his finger, and I hear him, "Peter, not too much detail now. Remember the rules." And Bob Fernand in my other ear saying, "We need more details. Where's the details?" Can you then be surprised that I was blinking and squinting at times in Baghdad? And this was commented on by viewers, and I want to tell you, Virginia, they were not coded signals I was sending to the CIA. They were simple, heartfelt cries for help. So there were constraints on me, I mentioned, from the Iraqi side, particularly on military information, but there were also constraints on me from my awareness of criticism in the United States. And, you know, we reporters, we're not impervious to what is going on back home. I was aware of it in Vietnam, but not to the degree that I was aware of it in Iraq, because instant communications, it all comes back right at you. In fact, one of CNN's military analysts brought on board for the duration, a former Air Force General, Perry Smith, relentlessly attempted to question my reporting on bombing of Baghdad and about civilian casualties and the many broadcasts I did during the war. And in a recent Insider book, he questioned my professionalism and patriotism. He concluded in criticism is that I was what he called a feeler, somebody, he says, who empathizes with people around him. Well, I figured that's a human frailty, certainly not too evident in Air Force generals. Do we get a laugh from this crowd for a crack like that? But such attitudes did constrain me. Take this, for example. I have here a battered paperback copy of William Thackeray's novel Vanity Fair. It's a favorite of mine, but I picked it up in Al-Dur city. That's a community north of Baghdad. It's a bedroom community for a military-industrial complex several miles to its south. That military-industrial complex was frequently targeted by Allied warplanes. But Al-Dur, too, took its share of hits. And one field trip, I counted over a score of deep bomb craters in a civilian area. And it was from one of the demolished homes that a home where neighbors and Iraqi officials claimed everyone who had been killed, that I took this dusty volume. Now, this is an area where you could probably say that the bombing was unfortunate because it was relatively near a military area that needed to be hit. But the name inscribed in this book is Raida Abdul-Aziz, and neighbors said she was age 19, attended the University of Baghdad, and was majoring in English literature. There are numerous intimate margin notes, and on a separate piece of paper I found in the book, she wrote these comments about Vanity Fair's main protagonist. Quote, "Rebecca Sharp was not a kind, forgiving person. She said all the world treated her badly. The world is a mirror. If you will look angrily back at it, it will look angrily back at you. If you laugh at it and with it, it's a warm, kind companion." No, I didn't hold this tattered paperback in front of the camera and remind our viewers that innocents die in war, no matter how high the purpose and how smart the bombs. Basically, I chickened out because at that point in the war, I'd been criticized for interviewing Ramsey Clark, who'd been visiting Baghdad. At that point, to suggest that Iraqis were not only human, but some even sensitive to Western literature, would have been too much meat to give to a critical audience. After all, most people were content to believe that every Iraqi was exactly like Saddam Hussein. Now that passions have cooled, I can reveal to you that Iraqis are really just like you and me, but have the misfortune to be generations away from the democratic way of life we enjoyed. So a little more than a year ago tonight at this time, I was crouching in the garden of the Al Rashid Hotel. It was bitterly cold, and I was fumbling with the unfamiliar mechanism of a satellite telephone. I was writing my reports in longhand because the batteries in our portable laptop computers had long since expired. There were no elevators in service, so I walked up and down the 9 flights of stairs to our temporary office because there was no electricity, there was no heat. A flashlight became an essential tool for survival. At times there were fistfights over stolen flashlights. They became important as horses in the Old West. There was no running water, and I learned to shower and shave and shampoo and 1 bottle of mineral water a day. And when I mentioned this to Bob Kane on the air, he says, "You'll have to demonstrate that for us one of these days, Peter." I didn't. There were some great news scoops, such as my interview with Saddam Hussein, but I suffered indignities to get them. For example, Saddam's security man insisted I strip naked in a hotel room and undergo a thorough clothing and body search before the interview. In addition, when I dressed, I was required to sterilize my hands in a strong disinfectant before shaking his. On the way to the interview, driven alone in a black late model BMW through the back streets of the fearful Baghdad, I felt some apprehension about meeting a man characterized by President Bush as Hitler and the Butcher of Baghdad. But I was aware that Saddam Hussein had personally permitted CNN to remain in Baghdad for the war, and in my interview with him, it sort of became clear some of his reasons. At the beginning, he invited me to ask any question that I wished, and I covered the whole field from his intentions towards Israel and the American POWs in his hands and through to the apparent impossibility of his succeeding in stopping the Allied military juggernaut opposing them. But usually in his responses, Saddam Hussein would direct his answers towards his main message, that he and Iraq were the victims of American aggression. He kept saying that he was appealing to the anti-war elements in the West and in the coalition, the population to rise up and overturn this policy. The Iraqi leader realized that CNN was an open communication to the leaders of the Allied coalition, to many of the peoples. And he tried to use it. And his television style was masterful. He remained unflappable throughout the interview. He was a diplomat. At the end, in fact, he insisted we pose for photographs. 2 hours later, despite the bombing of the city and the lack of electricity, a courier banged on my door in the hotel and thrust this into my hand. And it reads from the office of President Saddam Hussein of the great nation of Iraq. I open it, and inside the photographs, a couple of pages of pictures. And I show you these because I smuggled them back into the country a year ago. So I show you these because of the unique circumstances of the transaction. I was aware that Saddam usually had pictures taken of his guests, but he sends these presentation folders to people that he's met. But this selection was put together in the most difficult circumstances. As I said, it was late at night, there was no running water, there was no light in our part of town. The photographer who took them had his work cut out for them, trying to get them ready. And it was a lousy job. The photos are already fading, but Saddam made his diplomatic point that night. So Saddam's message, words don't kill, his plea fell flat in the world. People heard what he said. They listened to his viewpoint. They did not flock to his side and overturn participating allied governments as those seemingly those who were concerned about my coverage in Baghdad feared. I mean, we can't be frightened of words and information. It's important that we listen to it. So, Atlanta, that's where CNN is located. That's where our Gulf coverage started. That's where we still are. It may seem an unusual place and unusually positioned to be one of the world's most influential news organizations. After all, Georgia is perceived as being far from the major centers of world action. The reality today, however, is that there are no major centers anymore for many institutions, businesses, organizations, professions. The technological revolution, the use of the satellite telephone, the fax machine, computers, advances in cable communications, the potential of fiber optics, each of these has made all of us, each, a command and control center. It's irrelevant where CNN is based. What is relevant is how CNN gathers its news and dispenses it, and the impact it has on the political, financial, and social forces of the world today. This global village idea, after all, has been talked about for years, but only now has the technology made it possible, enabling us to wire the world. We have to go back to the invention of the international telegraph at the turn of the century and the advent of radio in the 1930s to equal such a watershed in the communication of news. Forget the old diplomatic pouch routine in times of real-world crisis. What better way for the U.S. State Department to make its opinions quickly known about an overseas flashpoint than by putting its spokesperson on CNN, with every foreign office in the world watching? In late February this year, on the anniversary of the beginning of the ground war in the Gulf, General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was interviewed live on CNN. At one point during the interview, he looked directly into the camera and he said, those who are watching in Baghdad, don't ever consider invading a neighboring country again. Now, that's direct diplomacy. I mean, General Powell acted like he's talking to Saddam Hussein himself. Maybe he was. Certainly senior Iraqi officials are watching. That our news broadcasts are being watched by governments all over the world, we well know. The Swedish foreign minister told me when I visited Stockholm late last year that his ministry monitors CNN 24 hours a day, a revolving team of translators, and they report new developments to the responsible officials upstairs. Another example, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times reported in February on the visit by Secretary of State James Baker to the former Soviet republics of Central Asia. Usually one of the first questions Baker was asked by the new chiefs of state was, quote, how do I get CNN, unquote. Friedman wrote that the Central Asians were obsessed with being able to get their news from sources independent of Moscow. Having CNN, they explained, was the symbol of such independence, as well as a real membership card in the Club of Western States. This media revolution is particularly spectacular to me because when I began my journalism career 30 years ago, I was assigned to Jakarta, Indonesia as a correspondent for the Associated Press. Each day my dispatches were punched by Morse key through to Tokyo and from there by telex to AP headquarters in New York. Today, portable ground stations and satellite telephones allow me and my colleagues to bring instant real-time coverage to you from anywhere in the world, from Baghdad to Bangor, Maine. So what about the potential in the future? CNN, television news. Our executives tell me that there's no reason why CNN can't live up to our promise of providing the cutting edge of news coverage in the future. We have the personnel. CNN's the only television news operation still hiring and not firing people. I have my fingers crossed, but it's happening. We've got the technology and the other resources necessary to fulfill our role as a news service to the world. We are proud that the Wall Street Journal recently described CNN as a global intercom. We're only 11 years old, but we're growing larger and more experienced, and the more we cover the unfolding crises, these unscripted news stories around the world, the better we get at doing it. Not all the flow of negative mail is stopped. I gave you an example there. I got a lot last year, but it seems now that there is a fringe element that whenever I'm interviewed in a newspaper, if my picture appears, such as this one I got last week, written on it, "The face of treason." Hey, that's me. So it's just I won't read the letter. There's too many four-letter words. But this one, this is not unusual. "Why don't you go back to Iraq, you traitor? You don't deserve to live here anymore. You would do anything against the USA. to earn a dime, traitor. I actually got an earlier one. I got a later one which says, you are still a traitor, but perfectly same handwriting. And this one, this appeared about 10 days ago from the South somewhere, with my picture attached, clip from a newspaper. And this one says, you, Mr. Arnett, are a traitorous slimeball. Surely it is no coincidence that you work for an organization that is possibly controlled by the most despicable and treasonous woman on earth. There you go. I am delighted that Jane Fonda is part of the CNN's larger family. And in fact, one of the letters I did receive, which I read in her presence last year, was after attacking me vehemently for Baghdad. There was a P.S. and it says, now I know that you're really rotten because I've been told you were Jane Fonda's chauffeur in Hanoi in 1972. But actually, I was in Hanoi in 1972, but I did not have the privilege of driving her around. So the reach of television today is phenomenal. We know that, and with satellites carrying broadcasts to places in the world previously in near total political and geographic isolation. In fact, we can reach every corner of the world, of the inhabited world, I believe, and much of the uninhabited world. The immediacy and power of the news, when seen and heard and felt as it is today, is spreading interest in news around the world. What an enormous challenge that is for us in the news media, and I don't mean only the American news business. And the Neiman program, as it recognized many years ago, news is an international commodity. Reporters are international citizens. And the sponsorship of these fellowships by this organization have helped pave the way to this new international order of communications. CNN has taken the idea a little further, actually, of not only bringing news persons from abroad, talented ones, and telling about what makes it tick. We've encouraged television organizations from all over the world to contribute news stories for us to use. In turn, we invite their sharing our insights into news gathering and dissemination. Each year there's an annual conference in Atlanta, World Report Conference, of all these editors, producers, executives. We sit around in Atlanta and talk about how we better can improve the news product, trying to explain to them the need for free press. And we're getting an enormous response. I think 120 countries contribute regularly. As journalists, after all, we need all the help we can get. We don't know really much about this world we're moving into. You can call it the beginning of a new world order or the post-communist nirvana. You know, we don't have any grand scenario to work with. No one has a grand scenario to work with at this point. I mean, there was George Kennan's celebrated X blueprint that he drew up in the late 1940s that defined containment of communism, but there's nothing like that anymore. Containment of Japan? No, that's not going to work. We're all really feeling our way, not only in news, but in business and politics. But I feel that the climate for the practice of international reporting is improving, even as the need for better directed reporting comes obvious. And I mentioned earlier about how governments are really interested in seeing CNN, seeing the flow of information. So they see what comes across. They see what George Bush says about the world. They want to make their input into it. This new world, I think we're emerging for those reasons, will make us better able to do our job. And at home, too, I think the climate is changing. Attitudes of people are changing, certainly to international reporting. It was not so long ago that being a war correspondent on the enemy's side was clearly not the easiest way to advance one's career. I remember the former president of the Associated Press, a great man, Wes Gallagher. He wrote me last year to commiserate about the criticism of my Baghdad coverage, and he pointed out that the great AP reporter Louis Lochner was similarly severely criticized for reporting from Berlin up to the time the United States entered World War II. And there were, of course, Harrison Salisbury's experiences in Hanoi in December of 1966. The New York Times reporter was one of the first journalists to visit the North Vietnamese capital. He reported, one of his quotes was that whatever the explanation, one can see that United States planes are dropping an enormous weight of explosives on purely civilian targets, unquote. His reports forced the Johnson administration to concede that American pilots had accidentally struck civilian areas while attempting to bomb military targets. Salisbury became a much-hated figure in Washington. At the time, conservative editor William Randolph Hearst suggested he was a Lord Haw-Haw. Now, you've heard that before. And war supporter columnist Joseph Alsop wrote that, quote, whether a United States reporter ought to go to an enemy capital to give the authority of his byline to enemy propaganda is an interesting question, unquote. Harrison Salisbury was denied a Pulitzer Prize that year by the Awards Advisory Board of Columbia University, even though he was the choice of the Pulitzer jury. Now, you've heard similar reporting of my criticism of my reporting from Baghdad, but I'll tell you how times have changed. On my return home, I've found that wealthy corporations have been prepared to offer me large sums of money to talk to them about the media, about the changing political scene, and about Saddam Hussein. Columbia University gave me not one award, but two. President Bush cracked a joke about my coverage at a Washington media dinner last year, and the commander of one stealth fighter squadron that regularly bombed Baghdad, he's gone on record as thanking me for the live coverage, saying that it was they'd rerun the video when they got home and they could pick out where they'd been bombing and who was doing the bombing. So on one hand, I shared with Louis Lochner and Harrison Salisbury attacks on my reliability, my competence, and my professional ability, but on the other hand, the public seems better able to understand our motivation in a world suddenly free of the specter of nuclear annihilation in its totality. But looking at our last international crisis, this Gulf War, how easily did we yield to the siren song of our government and tuck our critical faculties under our wings? And I'm not just talking about Baghdad, I'm talking about the Gulf. There's been enormous criticism of our coverage, even as President Bush is applauded for his adroit handling of the crisis. That adroitness included handling us, basically muzzling the press. At a recent conference by the Canadian Institute of International Peace and Security, a Lebanese commentator for both PBS and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation complained, quote, to kick the Vietnam syndrome, the government decided that there would be no pictures of pain or blood from the Gulf War, no pictures of dead children. She said, I think the media became the mouthpiece for the government. The media gave up its privilege of free criticism, reinforced the us versus them syndrome, unquote. Some might say that the speaker, Rajida Durgan, is an Arab and her views are biased, but in actual fact she reflects a widening view amongst the establishment media in the United States that the Pentagon and the White House took us for a ride in their promises to allow full coverage of the Gulf War under their special pool system. They didn't. Now, are we going to allow the government to decide for us what the priorities should be in this new world order, as they basically did in the Gulf War? Or decide for us what we should be reporting about whatever emerges from the detritus of the former Soviet bloc? The temptation might be there. The distinguished former columnist, or current columnist, Tom Wicker wrote in 1978, quote, my belief is that the gravest threat to freedom of the press is not necessarily from public animosity or distrust, legislative action or court decision. And he pointed out that the repeal of the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech was unlikely. And he continued, quote, at least as great a threat, I believe, comes from the press itself and its longing for a respectable place in the established political and economic order, in its fear of the reaction that boldness and independence will always evoke. Self-censorship silences effectively as a government decree, and we have seen it far more often. Tom Wicker's words. Now, do we really want to let government set our journalistic agenda for the future as we have done so much in the past? And what is that agenda now that the Cold War is over? We must clearly go beyond narrow self-interests. I mean, what do we have here? The environment and the assaults upon its integrity that might deny a birthright to our children's children. The chain reaction of population explosion and its threat to our future. Nuclear proliferation, the insidious potential of the continuing arms trade. So that is the challenge for today's news media with its adroit gadgetry and worldwide audience. Here at home, we've proven that in the press, we're masters at picking apart the character of a front-running Democratic candidate for the presidency, but let's be just as good at assessing our brave new world and getting our priorities figured out. I have a lot of confidence in the potential of the news media to fulfill the great need demanded of us today. Historically, we've usually risen to the occasion. William Howard Russell of the London Times exposing the blunders of the Crimean War and persuading Florence Nightingale to assemble her nursing corps and go to the front. Even Richard Harding Davis writing with Teddy Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War, he was helping to define the character of an aggressively aspiring young nation. And then in World War II, the reporters and photographers like Ernie Pyle, Hal Boyle, Ed Murrow, some who gave their lives to convey the urgency of world war, and in Korea and Vietnam, the scores of news people charting the frustrations of national policy that seems corrupted by arrogant disregard for veracity. And on to the declining days of the Cold War, Iran, where Joe Alex Morris Jr. gave his life, charting the emergence of a great new force in the world scene, Islamic fundamentalism. The pursuit of truth today is no less dangerous than at any other time in modern history. I want to believe that we are up to its challenges. Thank you very much.
We have two microphones here, and Peter has agreed to take a few questions, beginning over here.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. The theme that you've elaborated is the global nature. I think CNN by now has pretty much a monopoly on that global communication. And I wonder how much you as a reporter and the other reporters you work with worry, number one, about the monopoly, number two, about the ability of your station to be manipulated by either aggressive governments or by, that is, aggressive government action, or by the laziness of the reporters who prefer to pick up predigested news stories rather than to go out and dig them up themselves. So I wonder how much you worry about those issues. And the third issue with a station like CNN is the mixture of editorializing which occurs with news. So when you watch CNN, you don't just get news, you get a heavy dose of editorial, not in the news segment, but in those things that they mix in, those talk show kind of programs. So it's not just news you're watching editorials too. I wonder what your thoughts of those issues are.
And I've heard your concerns before. They're constantly being stated to us. We're concerned about all, to tell you the truth. All those areas to answer you fully would require much more of your time than much more of your time. I've got all the time in the world. Dr. Galbraith told me that, you know, when you're in Harvard, you've got to make it long and boring. That's the style here. But I don't know how tolerant you are. You know, I'd like to address that we're concerned about all those issues. Sure, when I look at just the international nature of the beast we have, CNN, but I'd like to point out this is a very competitive world. And if CNN starts airing reports that just don't seem right, you know, there are competitors for CNN. We have the print media competes. You know, the other networks compete, magazines compete, the BBC competes. Everyone's competing to take a piece out of CNN. You know, we've got all sorts of critics there. They're all looking to bring down the leader. We have certainly emerged into prominence in this aspect of international coverage. Everyone's trying to tear us down. You know, we're worrying about what we put on the air constantly because we don't want to be damaged by what you say. You know, we look to professionalism in the company. We hire professionals. We act professionally, and you know, we're self-policing, and that's as good as I can tell you. You know, it's a constant concern, and I tell you, our management is more concerned than you are about what goes on our air and what goes into the coverage, and we're watching it, and we'll continue to do it. As far as us being somehow a rogue elephant, the potential, I don't think news is a rogue elephant. I think we don't make decisions. The press doesn't right policy or destroy it. We offer ideas, and really it's up to, as I say, even the interview of Saddam Hussein, it did not bring the war effort crashing to a halt. He had his moment in the sun, 90 minutes on our air, and the lives of no one was changed.
What about the
so I
issue
think
of
that basic information is not dangerous, and I think if we think about, I hope in this new world we have, or this new system, we'll realize that information is not dangerous, facts are not dangerous, and that we can disseminate this freely. We all need it. We need to know more about each other and what's happening. The more the dissemination, the better informed we're going to be.
What about the mixture of news and editorial, and why maybe we saw so much of Pat Buchanan during on an all-new station?
Well, I don't think you're not suggesting that Pat Buchanan is subtle, are you? If any man so obviously presented a viewpoint, it was Pat Buchanan. Hey, he has a column. Newspapers put it in. I think it's clear what those views are. It's that particular program. It's it's shock therapy in a sense. I mean, I don't think anyone is pretending that it's news. I think people enjoy it, and they can. I think the reasonably educated viewers are going to be informed by it rather than abused by it or misled by it. Thank you.
Okay. Minor question. Why do so many Iraqis speak English?
Why do so many? Well, the other question might be, why don't enough American officials speak Arabic? Now, the main reason they speak, I'll just answer that. The main reason a lot of Iraqis speak English is that is the second language of the Middle East, English. And they've been educated in Europe, they told me, in the United States, and that is the second. Every street sign in Baghdad is in Arabic and English. Every hotel is in Arabic and English. And they have an English language newspaper. So it is the second language of the region. So there's a lot of people speak it. Yes, sir.
I am an Iraqi, and I was actually watching your reports during the war. I was very saddened to see my country being destroyed the way it was by, I think, one of the most powerful military forces in this century. I personally did not feel that CNN was giving a very objective view of the war. At the same time, I felt that possibly CNN was actually being manipulated by the government in giving a very sanitized version of the war. How do you feel about, I guess, working for an institution that you feel might be being used in such a way? I guess you touched on the question a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'd like to think that we did not willingly go to the slaughter. Our Washington bureau chief had conference after conference with the Pentagon and the White House, with other media bureau chiefs to clear up, clear up our rights and our obligations and our opportunities. We went to the Gulf War thinking we could cover it. It was only in the end that we were cut off. So, we didn't. I mean, there may be a tendency, I suggested, for the media generally to be willing to identify with a government policy in times of stress, but I think in this case it's clear that we thought we were getting an opportunity to cover it, and we weren't. And I assure you that not only CNN, but all of the mainstream media have been to the authorities time and again, to the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, to others, to insist that next time we don't be treated in that way, to actually suggest that next time around maybe we'll be less willing to go along with government restriction. I mean, there's no constitutional requirement that we all fall in line and go into a pool system. I mean, and I think that there has to be give and take, and we're dissatisfied. What happened in the Gulf was a culmination of a whole decade of increasing press controls that started in Grenada, continued to Panama, and totally flourished in the Gulf. We want that to be the end of it all and to have a whole new approach next time around. That's what we're working to.
I think I'd also like you to answer one more question. During the 10 years of the war with Iran, the Americans supported Saddam, and there seemed to be a very, the attitude of the press towards Saddam was very positive. At the same time, once America decided to go against this gentleman, I mean, I deplore what he does in Iraq, and he's still there. The war does not seem to have achieved its objective. I noticed that the media changed their opinions about Saddam and started highlighting all the atrocities that he was carrying out 10 years before also. And that's very sad. And when you comment on the independence of the press, it seems to be in words only and not in actions.
Well, okay. Now I'm getting a sense of what you're all about. The Saddam Hussein, the reason that it all changed was that government policy towards him changed and re-reflected government policies. Up to August 1 of 1990, I mean, American congressmen were going to Baghdad and shaking Saddam's hand. They were secretly getting huge, bank loans to him to buy military equipment. We were giving him military intelligence, But then he went and invaded Kuwait, and all bets were off. Suddenly became the enemy, and we in the press reflected that. I don't think any reporter got up and said Saddam is a bad man. I've told you what I think of Saddam. He was very diplomatic. He gave me some pictures. I haven't said he's a bad man. But I've quoted George Bush as saying he's the butcher of Baghdad. That's the president's privilege, and I quote him. But, a lot of what you see in the press is not guys like me making it up or dreaming it up. It's reflecting what other people think. That's what most of the media is simply. News is essentially what we're telling you what others are doing or what events are happening. We're not really doing it. That's the difference.
I guess I'll end it on a last note. I think as the media, I understand your need to sell to the public, and at the same time I feel you probably have to sell to them what they want, and that really determines what you actually portray every particular politician to be as.
Yeah, well, maybe you're right, except in this political year, what do the public want? I don't know. Maybe. But yeah, we could talk about that indefinitely too, but thank you for raising it. Ma'am, over here.
Looking back at your career, what would you value more, or what would you see as your greater contribution? Providing actual news, facts, or information, and especially in this past war, that has been debated, with the accusations of sensationalism or whatnot, or just making the point that the coverage should have been made from, behind the enemy line or from the other point of view?
Now, the only reason I was behind enemy lines is that that's where fate had taken me, and I was just gathering information in that particular place. I'm a reporter. I'm a news gatherer. In Vietnam, I used to say I only reported what I saw, because that way, if the critics would have to say that I'm lying, but no, I mean, as a reporter, I believe that raw information, I think, is important to peoples. The White House felt contrary. They would rather have cycled that information, through their own prisms. I mean, raw information can be devastating when you have pictures from a air raid shelter in which 330 people have died, most of them women and children. I mean, it's devastating information. But that's what I, as a reporter, am all about. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm not making any point. What the point I think I was making is that hopefully the U.S. public, with the Cold War over, will be less, be less concerned about. They'll be more into information rather than the politicization of events. Let's look at the facts and determine it in that way.
And also, with CNN around, is there a future for print journalism?
I said we're still hiring, but now, of course there's a future. In fact, the Gulf War coverage, while CNN got wonderful ratings, the circulations apparently of all American newspapers increased in proportion. So it was the news, the fact of news and information that sold, and that people were just wanting to learn more about the event. And so therefore, I think that, sure, there's a place for print. The industry is sorting itself out. There are fewer newspapers, but from what I can see, those newspapers are superb. There has to be a role indefinitely. We cannot replace print. We don't want to replace print. We couldn't replace print. Thank you.
That's the last question. Sorry. Were there other foreign journalists in Baghdad? You were the only American.
No, I was there for 10 days as the only American. There was a Spanish reporter, 3 Jordanians, and some Iraqis. After 2 weeks, many more journalists came. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I admire your courage during the war. Tell me, as a reporter and as a man, how did you handle the fear that you could be killed at any time during this war?
I didn't have the fear that I could be killed during any time of the war, and I hate to sound overly emboldened. I told a story earlier to the Neiman Fellows that when I went to Vietnam, I was there for 10 years. I started as a kid, and 2 or 3 years into the war, a veteran from World War II, Kai's Beach, came in, and I came back one day and he says, "Oh, God, it was terrible. 10 people were killed, and I got shot at." And he says, "Huh?" He says, "I was at Iwo Jima. 10,000 died. What are you talking about, kid?" And so I learned then that it's all relative. So by the time Baghdad came along, after many of these events, I looked at the odds and figured, these smart bombs are so smart, they're not going to hit our hotel. We are not targets, and I was right. So in that case, I didn't have fear. Now, other times when I've had fear, I just bury my face in the sand and curse myself for making the decision for being there. Right. Sir.
I am from Germany. I'm an expert on the Middle East, working at the moment at Harvard. The Wilson Center in Washington just published a book about the coverage on the Gulf War under the title Hotel Warrior. This is not my source of information. I myself, I was commenting during the Gulf War in the major channel of German television, Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen, ZDF, and other channels. And I was, in January, unlike you, in January and February, I was mostly in studios, in television studios, and comparing our expertise, the experts, sitting in a studio and commenting on the events with the correspondents who were on the spot, mostly in the hotels, we always found that they didn't know much more about us. So, the question is the access to information. People were in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, in Baghdad, in Rashid. At the beginning there were others, with you, but they were mostly staying in Rashid, and they had very limited access to information. So, this reproach, hotel coverage, television coverage, press coverage, done from the hotel or hotel warrior. How do you face this this reproach, and how do you face the other issue, which is not a reproach, it's just a description, and this is my experience in the war, while sitting in the studios of ZDF, ARD, and other German TV channels, and I did not find, and I also was watching your reporting, and I did not find, and the other experts who were there with me, we did not find that the people who were at the spot knew more than we knew.
Well, I'm sorry, it's a catchy title. I could have used it on my book that I'm seeking a title for. Hotel Warrior. I like it. You make a good point, except I can only speak about Baghdad, but we just had to put the camera out the window each day. And we'd see the bombers coming in and the anti-aircraft going up and huge explosions, and I don't know what you were looking at out of your window back in Frankfurt, but I knew what I was looking at.
Well, in the studios if there are no windows.
Secondly, we took a trip every day through Baghdad, and every second day into the countryside, we went down to Basra. I saw, lots of people dead and wounded. All I was trying to do from that venue was to explain what was going on in the capital city. That was the center point of the air war. So we could travel around Baghdad. We talked to people under limited circumstances. We got pictures. We got the audio, the sound of it, the sirens. What more else could I have gotten? I don't know. I interviewed Saddam Hussein. At that point in the war, what are experts for? You've got the biggest bombing raids in history, trying to knock down and trying to dismantle the command and control structure of Baghdad, and you've got General Schwarzkopf trying to determine when it was ready to go into fight the ground war, and who knew what? Maybe Saddam Hussein knew. But, I felt that everything considered, we got an enormous amount of information out of that locale. If it wasn't enough for your purposes, I'm sorry. Now, in Saudi Arabia, there were real limitations. They were stuck in hotels. It's true, but I hope this Wilson institution study points out whose fault that was. It was the authorities for not letting the reporters out of the hotel. I mean, this is something, and I hope that their criticism is directed less at the press than at the Pentagon for enforcing these restrictions.
Now, just touching on this point, and then I complete. I mean, in other words, there were restraints there. For instance, the journalists working on the spot, they couldn't know more than General Schwarzkopf wanted them to know, and also Saddam Hussein. Because, I mean, for instance, you in Iraq, you were under surveillance, and you could not have the action that you wanted to, to pursue beyond this surveillance. And the others who were not under surveillance, they went to the, to the press conferences of Schwarzkopf, and they reported what he said, but they didn't have information on their own.
You know, well, you know, the ideal, of course, is to get access to everything, you know, to have a live camera on the leading tank. Maybe we'll do that next time around. But, of course, there's limitations. I agree. You know, I agree, and it was, but, you know, it's amazing to me that so many people felt that they learned more about what happened over there than other conflicts. I think it was the idea of the live press conference. There's nothing wrong with a live briefing, by the way. If you got the briefer standing in Riyadh or Dhahran and saying, today we have just done this and we've launched the attack on Kuwait, that's fascinating information. If it's live, great, you know. And if you can see the bombs falling, if the bombs coming in Baghdad, you know, well, people are just interested in the fate of the whole enterprise. And if we can contribute somehow, good. We would like to contribute much more. And next time we want to do much more. But sure, there's limitations. I agree. You know, we're fighting to get a better, you know, better opportunities next time. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Janet Hawkins from Harvard Magazine. When you presumably were well covered by CNN insurance-wise when you were standing around the pool and were admirably unafraid of the shrapnel falling around you, the reason I ask is that I'm wondering, in this great, you know, new media world we have ahead of us, what is going to happen in the future with the young stringers who are sneaking over borders and trying to go beyond staying in the hotel. A year ago on Sunday, a graduate of Harvard University was killed near Kirkuk. He was on assignment for Newsweek, and his mother has had to fund her own trip to Iraq. She has gotten no help from Newsweek or his picture agency. And this seems to be a very shadowy, very ambiguous area of who reaps the benefits of this and who pays the price.
No, that's a very good question. It's been argued as long as I've been a journalist. There were reporters killed in Vietnam, photographers injured in Vietnam. They had to take news organizations to court. Tim Page, a stringer for Life magazine, took Time Life to court. It took him 10 years to collect $60,000. That he'd been wounded grievously, and families have been seeking compensation for the lives of their loved ones. But, you know, as long as you have young people who want to go out and make a career of themselves, you're going to have those risks. When I was 22 years of age, I swam the Mekong River on a daily basis with copy in my mouth. I was a stringer for the AP, and I had copy for the New York Times and the London Daily Express and others who were paying me to take it across to Thailand to cable it out. Now, I could have drowned, anything could have happened, but I was willing to do it. But I survived it. Others don't. But, you know, the factor of compensation is a difficult one, because an organization will not insure a young person. If a young person calls the CNN and says, look, I'm going to Afghanistan with a camera, and if I get anything, I'll send it to you, and maybe you'll like it, and he dies. I mean, what is the responsibility? Our company
But you think that huge media organizations have no accountability for what happens to people that they say are on assignment for them?
No, I don't say for a minute no accountability. It's a case-by-case arrangement, really. You know, when I went into Baghdad, I got on a plane with a CBS correspondent and producer, and this was just 5 days before the war started, and they did not have a crew because CBS couldn't come up with the adequate insurance for the cameraman and soundman. They said, we're not going. So, and so it is a factor, but it's tough. I mean, it's a case-by-case basis. You know, in truth, young people who want to make a name for themselves in the news business, you know, will go out and do it, and they're not probably going to get much compensation. And if they get hurt, it's a pity, and it's tough, it's dangerous, you know, it's unwise. But a lot of people have done it, including me, and probably a lot will continue to do it. But it's a hard one.
Take one more question here.
Yes, sir.
I happen to know the opinion of the Russian journalists on why we didn't finish Saddam Hussein. They say it's because we wanted to keep him as a counterbalance against Iran. What do you think about it? And forget for a minute you're just a reporter, and imagine you're a politician. And why is this popular question so rarely reflected in the media?
On the contrary, I think it's discussed considerably by columnists, certainly inside the Beltway where I happen to live, just inside, by about half a mile. Columnists are always talking about, will it become an issue, the fact that Saddam Hussein is still there, and will George Bush be required to knock him out? There are all sorts of reasons or answers given or suggestions made about why George Bush didn't finish him off. I mean, the obvious one is that the UN mandate was to get Saddam's forces out of Kuwait and destroy his military, and it said nothing about going to Baghdad and destroying his government.
But we didn't destroy his military. We did not destroy his military.
Okay, that's what has been written lately, and from what I've heard, is that the war happened so quick, 4 days of action. There was some misunderstood signals that the commanders were under the impression that an important strategic maneuver, tactical maneuver, had been completed. That was to cut off the exodus from Kuwait of all the forces. It had not been completed when the ceasefire was declared. There were 20 kilometers wide open, and through that 2 Republican Guards divisions went up, going like this to the U.S. troops. What I've also heard is that Gorbachev prevailed on George Bush when the ground war started, pointing out to him the then powerful Soviet military were very unhappy at the prospect of Saddam being destroyed, that his military being destroyed, and that they may not be as generous in their support of Gorbachev's reforms if the war went through to destroy the military organization and man that they had actually built up. And for that reason, maybe George Bush was interested in stopping it. In truth, in Baghdad, my feeling was that a division of U.S. armor could have come only 85 miles from Baghdad as it was along the Euphrates River. They could have forded it easily, and they could have come into Baghdad without a shot being fired and would have taken the city and ultimately got Saddam Hussein. But I think Schwarzkopf and everyone knew that, but they didn't bother. And that's one of these little mysteries of the war that we'll keep contemplating for a long time to come. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.